Good morning, Julie. Hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me okay? So let's do a sound check. Julie's like, I'm not at my computer. Let me run in the room. Awesome. Okay. So um I don't know if y'all watched. I know Julie did. But I highly encourage you. Julie, if you wouldn't mind, I'm eating. Um I don't know if y'all watched. I know Julie did. But I highly encourage you. Got to turn my sound off. Um, if you wouldn't mind, Julie, when you get done eating, if you would post the link to the video we did with the Cates brothers yesterday, I'd really appreciate it. If not, no big deal. I can do it afterwards. I really do think that the whole episode, podcast, if you will, was awesome because those of us who've been on this journey together could watch the responses of both Dwayne and Brian as some of the information that I had not yet shared with Brian, and I did that on purpose, um, so that we could capture the response because there's a lot of people who have no idea the enormous bombshell that Operation Gladio is. So, with that, I'm going to go ahead and start this chapter. While it's long, and it will be the only one we do today, most of it's kind of a review with a few highlights. It's chapter 6, The Empire on Which the Black Sun Never Set. Um, because it's kind of introducing the reader as if you don't know anything about Operation Gladio into the actual Gladio operations. So she has some kind of good additions. Plus, it's a good review, especially after our podcast yesterday. So she kind of walks through several of the different entities involved in Operation Gladio. The first one being Nazi Germany. So it's quoted, quote, by destroying communism in his country, meaning Hitler, he had barred its road to Western Europe. Dot, dot, dot. Germany, therefore, could rightly be regarded as a bulwark of the West against communism. So this guy, Lord Halifax, was the British ambassador to the US from 1940 to 1946. He also was the Secretary of State in the UK from 38 to 40. He spent time before that in India. So already, while he's in the US, he is making the case that Germany will be used against communism. And of course, this is very consistent with the whole fascism versus communism, creating the chaos so you can control the population, that we've discussed throughout this entire investigation into Gladio. Um, we also talked a little bit about yesterday about Churchill not being the originator of the phrase Iron Curtain, that it came from Germany, a fascist foreign minister in a speech in 1945. And it would be a year later that Churchill began using it on his US tour. Um, So again, this is outlining the ties of the UK government to fascism overall. So there was a pact signed called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August of 1939. Something that's important about that, but very rarely ever talked about in history lessons, is the popular interpretation of the Soviet compromise with Nazism. That this notorious pact was signed a full 11 months after the UK Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain at the time, signed an appeasement deal with Hitler in September of 1938, also known as the Munich Agreement. So you have Chamberlain basically appeasing Hitler almost a full year before the Soviets supposedly appeased Hitler. And what you will find is the whole reason the Soviets did that is because they try repeatedly to work with France and Britain against Hitler, and both France and Britain refused to work with them. So there's a couple of examples in here. The Alex Kreiner is a historian, and he's quoted as saying, "The story that we've been taught in school was that the British government agreed to partition Czechoslovakia only as a desperate measure to avoid a greater European war. This view is based on the idea that Germany was already an overwhelming military power and could easily have crushed Czechoslovakia's weak defense. However, this is patently false." He goes on to say, created in 1919, Czechoslovakia was the most prosperous, most dynamic, most powerful, and best administered of the states that emerged from the Habsburg Empire. The idea that the Germans had a military advantage and that Czechs' security was weak were both fabricated and a sustained propaganda campaign, which was orchestrated by the British media and government representatives to mislead the British and European public. The Czech army was known to be the best in Europe and was superior to the German army in every way except for air support. September 3rd, 1938, the British military attaché in Prague wrote a cable to London stating, "There are no shortcomings in the Czech army, as far as I've been able to observe." In addition, Czech security was supported by strategic alliances with France and the Soviet Union, both of whom were at the time very keen on holding Germany in check, and both of whom were significantly superior to Germany. So you have an alliance, for example, that basically could have at any time thwarted Hitler, and yet they didn't. So that calls into question this pact even more. Um, when Chamberlain enters a pact with Hitler, knowing that there is overwhelming strength to defeat Hitler at that time, you realize that defeating Hitler was never the goal. Quote, history shows that when any state intends to make war against another state, it begins to seek frontiers across which it can reach the frontiers of the state it wants to attack. I do not know precisely what frontiers Germany may adapt to her aims, but I think she will find people willing to lend her a frontier. That was from Stalin. And so, what Stalin realized at that point is by basically giving Czechoslovakia to Hitler, they were providing an avenue for him to attack the Soviet Union. And he recognized it. These statements were made, the Stalin statements were made before the Munich Agreement, which was just that, a lending of a frontier of Czechoslovakia. Soviets to Multiple attempts were made by the Soviets to call for a defense pact with France and Britain in the case that Germany would launch an attack. On March 18th, 1939, at Stalin's direction, his Soviet Commissar for Foreign Affairs proposed that France, Britain, Poland, Russia, Romania, and Turkey join together at a conference to draw up a treaty to stop Hitler. Chamberlain strongly opposed this idea, writing to a friend, "I must confess to the most profound distrust of Russia. I have no belief whatsoever in her ability to maintain an effective offensive, even if she wanted. I distrust her motives." So that's one way of saying it. Or they were 100% behind Hitler with their mutual fascism. On April 14th, 1939, Lord Halifax, the British foreign minister at the time, said would not extend an alliance to Russia in case Germany were to attack. Russia was clearly being told to go it alone. 2 days later, Stalin had his foreign minister propose to Sir William Seeds, the British ambassador, that Russia, France, and Britain make a pact that would bind the countries to declare war on Germany if any of them were attacked. Both Britain and France refused to do that. The Munich Agreement allowed Hitler's Germany to acquire Czechoslovakia's superior army and transform Germany into a colossal military threat, and they did that on purpose. Germany was allowed to become the ultra supreme force through direct British intervention. Only 11 months later would Russia then sign a pact, a non-aggression pact, basically, with Germany because they saw the inevitable, and it was basically their last ability, um, so they thought, to avoid Germany's aggression, which Germany reneged on it anyway. And also, they note about how it was critical at this time that Germany have access to money. And by them taking Czechoslovakia, we learned a long time ago that the Bank of International Settlements was called up and said, "Hey, transfer all of Czechoslovakia's gold to the Germany's account," which they did. And that amount was 5.6 million pounds of gold they stole from Czechoslovakia, as well as their entire military, basically. And it was because Britain and France refused a partnership with Russia, Soviet Union, which they later had to have for their own survival. Irony. So with World War II won, we're going to use that in quotations because it's my thought that we didn't win. They just changed tactics on us. They went from an overt strategy of hostilities to a covert one via Operation Gladio. There was a thing, I've never heard of this one either. Operation Unthinkable is a prime example of the sort of thinking that ruminated in Britain and the US. Operation Unthinkable was the name given to two related possible future war plans by the British Chiefs of Staff against the Soviet Union in 1945. The creation of the plans ordered by Prime Minister Winston Churchill in May of 1945. And basically, one plan assumed a surprise attack on the Soviet forces stationed in Germany. And the second plan was a defensive scenario in which British would defend against, excuse me, a drive into the British soil, which, of course, we've talked about is the whole impetus for creating the stay behind units in Britain is supposedly under the auspices that they were going to get overran by not Germany, but the Soviet Union. So the we also talked about the fact that Churchill had began the implementation under the auspices of being invaded by Germany to create his stay behind network, but we can clearly see that they were for the most part in bed with Germany the entire time. So there's very little likelihood with their Mitford girls going back and forth and sharing intelligence during the entire World War II that they were in fear for their survival. So, another book that I've read, Danielle Ganser's NATO's Secret Armies, Operation Gladio and Terrorism in Western Europe, is quoted as saying that the clandestine network, which after the revelations of the Italian prime minister, which we've talked about, Andreotti, was researched by judges, parliamentarians, academics, and investigative journalists across Europe, is now understood to have been codenamed Gladio, the sword, in Italy. While in other countries, that network had different names. For example, Absalon in Denmark, ROC in Norway, SDRA 8, the number 8, in Belgium. In each country, leading members of the executive, including the prime minister, presidents, interior ministers, blah, 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 were in on the conspiracy. The Allied Clandestine Committee, ACC, was the entity, along with Clandestine Planning Committee, CPC, in NATO that organized all of the operations, the funding, the supplying. Um, and this all came out as a result of the investigation done by Italy. Leading officers and secret network trained together with the U.S. Green Berets, Special Forces in the United States, and the British SAS Special Forces in England. In case of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, the secret Gladio soldiers under NATO command were going to be the stay behind, which we all know was a ruse for them to set up these covert networks in their countries in order to control their own population. So the expected Soviet invasion never occurred because they never had any indication it was ever going to occur. They were to be used against the people, staging false flag operations that were blamed on communists. Panic, revulsion would be invoked, sending voters flocking into the arms of their secured right wing governments, which we know is another word for fascism because it's not right wing. But this is illustrative of the propaganda and why it's so useful to have it. When you can, against all critical thinking, pose fascists as right wing and get away with it, it's really a phenomenon because there's nothing right wing about fascists at all. But they had to have a quote unquote polar opposite of what they were proposing as left wing, i.e., communism, in order to be able to capture the people. So, Christopher Simpson writes in his book called Blowback how a substantial part of the funding for the opposition to the Communist Party in Italy was given to Christian Democrat Party, which were fascist. And it came from the Nazi assets that were largely held by the United States under their War Powers Act. And that the Christian Democrat Party was the home of the Italian fascist movement. It also, because of the terror attacks created and the false flags inside of Italy for 50 years, was they dominated the political scene inside of Italy because anytime someone that had a nationalist, true nationalist, or an opposing, more left wing philosophy, they would stage another terrorist attack, which sent the people careening back to the right Christian Democrat Party. In March 2001, General Giandiello Lamati, former head of the Italian counterintelligence, suggested that next to Gladio's secret armies, the Italian Secret Service and group of Italian right-wing terrorists, the massacres which had discredited the Italian communists had also been supported by the White House and the CIA. He's quoted as saying in testimony, the CIA, following the directives of its government, wanted to create an Italian nationalism capable of halting what it saw as a slide to the left, and for this purpose, it made use of the right-wing terrorism. And then there's some other things, and then he finishes saying, Italy has been dealt with as a sort of protectorate of the United States. That's literally what all of this boils down to. Okay, let me read what American Gorilla says. I am now 4 books into this, 6 counting 2 or more from other options, since I was there. This is I'm telling you, it's just crazy. And the more you dig, the more it all just so many things lights up. Um, Operation Gladio, with direction and support from the CIA and MI6, led a campaign of brutal violence against Italians that stretched into the better part of 2 decades, referred to as years of lead, which, of course, we already know. Ganser goes on and says findings of the Belgian parliamentary investigation into Gladio, a secret, and it was not very much of an investigation at all, a secret non Orthodox warfare even preceded the foundation of the alliance of NATO. As of 1948, non Orthodox warfare was created out of an entity called Clandestine Committee of the Western Union, CCWU. And that's a new one on me. I hadn't heard that. When in 1949 NATO was signed, the CCWU was secretly integrated into the new international military apparatus as of 1951, operating under the CPC, which we have learned about, and the ACC. He's quoted as saying, like the CCWU before it, the CPC was concerned with planning, preparation, and direction of non Orthodox warfare carried out by the stay behind armies and special forces. Only officers with the highest NATO security clearance were allowed to enter the CPC headquarters under the guidance of CIA and MI6 experts. And MI6, for those who don't know, is the equivalent of the CIA for Britain. In 1959, an internal NATO briefing minute dated June 1st, 1959, slipped into the hands of a British newspaper, leaked, revealing that the task of the stay-behind units had been switched from confronting a Soviet invasion to confronting an internal subversion. The secret armies were henceforth to play a determining role not only on the general policy level of domestic warfare, but also on the politics of the domestic emergency. So I want y'all to understand Gladio in the United States define patriots as terrorists. We are seeing it happen. Our FBI, which has members, obviously, of Gladio networked organizations, have prepared memorandums that label American patriots as domestic terrorists, as Catholics as domestic terrorists, parents as domestic terrorists. They are treating the United States citizens as enemy combatants. And that, in every single Operation Gladio scenario we have ever examined in these book reviews, is exactly the prototype used. Because then what do? After they labeled you a domestic terrorist, they stage events, false flags like January 6th, that was completely infiltrated with federal authorities. And I'm going to call them Gladio operators. They then used it as an excuse to storm people's houses. They used it as an excuse to arrest patriots, throwing in jail. If you read, I dare you to read any of these books and read the detailed operational handbook on how these operations are carried out and not tell me January 6th was a Gladio operation. I had an epiphany this morning that I posted. Given what I just told you, that the whole impetus is to label patriots as domestic terrorists. Do you think it's ironic that the name of the act after 9/11 was called the Patriot Act, which basically gave them the tools to label every patriot as a domestic terrorist and to hunt you down? I'm going to tell you that's not a coincidence based on everything that I have read. So just saying that. Operation Gladio, which used the strategy of tension, functioned on three basic levels. First was a guerrilla war to be fought primarily on the streets in order to draw loyalties away from the Soviet Union in that case. But I would argue that the guerrilla war here was being fought to draw loyalties away from Donald Trump. The second level is a political front and would involve NATO-inspired conspiracies, which is exactly what the FBI and CIA did, was to create Russiagate and all of the other conspiracies against Trump. The third level was to assassinations, either hard or soft, of figures who were deemed obstructive to NATO aims. And what did we have happen? They got rid of General Flynn in a soft assassination of eliminating him from Trump. The CIA memo signed by 51 CIA agents at the end of Trump's first term supposedly is what gave credence to Trump being a bad guy. So you've got the CIA, you've got all of the players involved that have been involved in Gladio operations all over the world, engaged in the United States in a soft coup that overthrew the election in 2020. It's all the exact same playbook. And then in the meantime, all of the other staging of events of Antifa, BLM, all of them are arms, in my opinion, of this operation. The author goes on and gives several examples that we've already been through, like Prime Minister Aldo Moro in Italy that was assassinated, Olof Palme in Sweden that was assassinated, Pope John Paul I was assassinated, Turkey Prime Minister Adnan Menderes assassinated, JFK assassinated. Soft assassinations is what I just explained, where they get rid of you without killing you by conducting disruption operations. And I posted about Harold Wilson on my Substack. That's when I said, was Trump Gladioed? He absolutely was. And I I outlined all of the similarities between the treatment that Harold Wilson had got and what had been done to Trump. It's called a soft assassination. Also, they tried to assassinate Charles de Gaulle over 20 times, and they tried to assassinate Pope John Paul II. So those are attempted assassinations that may or may not have, Charles de Gaulle was definitely part of Gladio, and so was John Paul II. So, because they were conducted by Gladio operators. So, the author goes on next to focus on Yves Garin Serac. His last name is Serac. It's a hyphenated name. Guerin hyphen Serac. He was basically what most of these authors refer to as Black Ops Grandmaster behind Operation Gladio. He had played an intricate role in some very significant pieces of the support elements of Gladio. For example, he's best known for his involvement in Portugal as the leader of their Gladio unit, but he became so useful to the entire network under NATO. He was part of what's referred to as a Genter press, Aginter, internal to Portugal. But that press was published a magazine, and they had such advanced printing capability that they are the ones that forged all of the passports, all of the identification network credentials that were used in the network. They also were located next door to a travel agent that made all of the necessary arrangements using those fake identification paperwork. So it was very, very important to the overall success of Operation Gladio. This guy was. He also was part of the apparatus trying to kill Charles de Gaulle. Our belief is that the first phase of political activity ought to be to create the conditions favoring the installation of chaos in all of the regime structures. In our view, the first move we should make is to destroy the structure of the democratic state under the cover of communist and pro-Soviet activities. Now it's Islamicism. Moreover, we have people who have infiltrated these groups. This is him talking. This is Surratt talking. He is telling you that they infiltrate the governments, like we've seen done with, I think the CIA's always been bad, but the FBI's definitely been infiltrated. The military's definitely been infiltrated. The State Department, all of it has been infiltrated. The IRS has been infiltrated. So that is their goal. They tell you that up front. He also says 2 forms of terrorism can provoke such a situation, with the situation being the breakdown of the state, which we are seeing in action in the United States. Blind terrorism, which is committing massacres indiscriminately, targeting large number of victims for the propaganda effect, and selective terrorism, which is basically assassination. This destruction of the state must be carried out under the cover of communist activity, or something foreign. We've changed since 91 from communist activity because China had not yet gotten to be the threat that they are today, into a transitional phase of Islamic terrorism. And we can see overtly them transitioning back to China being the big elephant in the room, if you will. So we're switching back to the communist narrative as well. After that, he goes on to say, we must intervene at the heart of the military, the judicial power, and the church. Let that sink in for just a second. He's telling you operationally exactly what they're doing. They are going to intervene at the heart of the military. We already know the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed Operation Northwood, which was going to murder massive amounts of innocent Americans. We're going to infiltrate judicial power, both by intimidation, which is what they tried to do with the Supreme Court, and by overtly buying judicial posts like Soros does. So you can see exactly what they're doing. They also say that they infiltrate the church, which we see happening because churches no longer speak out against evil. In order to influence popular opinion, suggest a solution, and clearly demonstrate the weakness of the present legal apparatus, destroy it. Popular opinion must be polarized in such a way that we are being presented as the only instrument capable of saving the nation. That's the part that we have to resist. And I will echo something that I forget who it was this morning was saying on social media. We just went through COVID. We just went through Ukraine. And we are, I think, I know how this is going to come off, but just hear me out. Everybody has been programmed. Everybody has been conditioned to elicit responses. I believe what we are being told or demonstrated is that all of your preconceived ideas are wrong. And so as soon as you get all of these influencers, to include famous Anon accounts, yeah, oh, I could call out Ukraine. Oh, yeah, I saw COVID coming a mile away. Then we get to Israel and they sink right back into the, oh my gosh, that's sacred. It has to be protected. We are being shown And then, of course, within days, it comes out that Israel has funded Hamas, and people's heads blow up. Every single thing that we have been told about the world is a lie. Our job is to critically look at every single thing. If our government is telling you somebody is good, they may not be good. If they're telling you they're bad, they may not be bad. So I'm suggesting to you, use critical thinking skills about everything, especially if the very first thing that comes out of their mouth or actions elicits an emotional response. 100% guaranteed the next thing out of their mouth will be a lie. They only emotionally create chaos when they want to follow it with a lie that they're telling you you have to believe. So just please be on the look out for that. And I'm going to say one last time, when we get done with this, nobody's going to have a rice bowl that doesn't have a little pea in it, because they're peeing in everybody's rice bowl, no matter what your rice bowl is. So just understand that. Oh, hey, Brian. All right, next. Antarctic random violence was to be used as a solution to bring about such states of instability, thus allowing for a completely new system, a global authoritarian, my words, New World Order, to be instituted. This is open fascism. On February 27th, 1933, the whole thing starts off with the burning of the Reichstag. So we know they set up a patsy, created the fire, and that fire gave Hitler all of the powers that he used to take over Germany. It started with a false flag. They continue to use false flags. The author goes through a little bit of the history of that. The fascist Gladio orchestrator Surratt spent his life dedicated to the new Black Empire. He wanted to take the divinity of the Roman Church, because he was a diehard Catholic, with the United States and Europe as a successor to the Holy Roman Empire. That was his vision. That's what he wanted to create, a new world order. And he was their chief crusader. The first generation of former Nazis and fascists, used as a veteran clan of French officers with already vested interest in Indo-China and the Korean struggle, which, as I mentioned, they went right from World War II into the Korean struggle, because they're always going to have perpetual war, because it facilitates their ability to create the New World Order. He talks about the French intel agency is called the SDECE, would be key in becoming the founding members of an organizational, a thing called Organisation Armée Secrète, OAS. OAS, if you were listening to me yesterday, two of their members, because it eventually becomes a French terrorist group, with assassins, marksmen, all of that. They begin training Operation Gladio units under the cover of Agento Press. So 2 OAS members were present in Dallas during the execution of JFK. Also about him, the principal funding was supplied by the CIA, according to the Pellegrino Commission established in 1995 by the Italian Senate to investigate the years of lead in Italy. Also coming out of that investigation, it was found that he was instructing local militant neo-fascist organizations in the use of explosives. From this nugget, the CIA is positively connected to Gladio and the wave of terrorism sweeping Europe. The author says that behind the plain business shop front of a ginger press was the invisible network. Then she goes on to talk about the falsification of passports and how they were able to get around and his role in training. So I don't know whether this was on purpose or not, but our Green Berets at Fort Bragg and Fort Benning and a couple of other locations have trained Gladio terrorists. I would like to believe that it was done under a false pretense, that they were told that they were part of the secret covert forces like themselves, kind of special forces of other governments. But they 100% have been actively involved in training Operation Gladio. The author then goes on and talks about the operations in Europe and Britain that had happened, and the false coup of their prime minister. The author also sets up the argument that Britain was involved in Operation Gladio and supporting Hitler throughout the World War II. She goes on to talk about how many Russians were lost. Hitler intended to starve 2.2 million Russian inhabitants. There were millions, both of civilians and military that were killed. 3 million Russians died in the first 7 months of the war. And Britain had engaged in an operation that was supposed to provide armaments to Russia. And they agreed to do so with the US and then never did it. So while Russians were dying on the vine, Britain was withholding critical infrastructure for them to be able to fight, even though they were already stated allies of Britain. And we also know about the whole secret agreements and all that other stuff, and how they lied about that. So there's basically, when you get down to it, nothing about Britain's role in the World War II that is actually factual that we learned in school. They were repeatedly, and you can look up a couple of operations, Operation Barbarossa, Sledgehammer, which was supposed to help Russia, and then they completely reneged on that. Operation Overlord. Those are just some of the things, if you want to do a dig on, that substantiates the fact that they here's a quote from Daniel Ganser's NATO Secret Army. With more victims than any other country during the World War II, the Soviet Union lost 15 million civilians and 7 million soldiers. Now, there's a common mantra that comes out of World War II. It's not that. Why is that? That's 22 million people. If we care about people, why do you not know that 17 million civilians and 7 million soldiers from the Soviet Union, basically Russians, were murdered? Why? While another 14 million were injured. Despite Moscow's urgent request, Great Britain deliberately refrained from establishing a second front against Hitler in the West, which naturally would have diverted Nazi troops and thus eased the onslaught. So was the real purpose of World War II to destroy Russia? You have to ask your question, because there's been an ongoing war against Russia from this point to today. We also know from their plans in the New World Order that pan-Europe goes all the way to the Urals, which is half of Russia. So they had tried repeatedly to destroy Russia. I would say they tried to destroy Russia by sending in the Bolsheviks. So there's just a complete inconsistency in the narrative that we've been taught and the facts on the ground. Ganser also says Hitler's annexation of Austria, a new department was created in MI6 labeled Section D, with the task to develop subversive operations in Europe. Section D of MI6, which is their CIA, was secret warfare restricted to Great Britain. This changed in 1940. Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered the creation of a secret army under the label SOE, Special Operations Executive, to set Europe ablaze by assisting resistant movements and carrying out subversive operation in enemy-held territory. The Prime Minister's War Department in 1940 records that the Prime Minister has further decided, after consultation with the ministers concerned, that a new organization shall be established forthwith to overseas. Under Minister Dalton, operational command of SOE was given to a Major General Sir Collins Gubbins, who was later to be influential in the buildup of British Gladio, because of course he would be. And then there's some other words, and it goes on to say, Special Operations Executive employed many of the staff of Section D and eventually became a major organization of its own right, operating on a global scale and in close cooperation with MI6. So then it goes on and has some other stuff, but basically we were under the impression that the SOE was disbanded after the war and the commander Gubbins resigns. Yet a new section called Special Operations, SO, was erected inside of MI6 and placed again under the command of General Gubbins. So you see, they literally changed nothing. We know that nothing changed in West Germany. All the Nazis still occupied all of the same jobs after the war. We know that for the first 16 years, the civilian in charge of NATO was a Nazi. The people that's carrying out these stay-behind units, all of them remained in place. So Gubbins becomes partners with Frank Wisner, who is the director of the covert operations under the CIA, which is called the Office of Policy Coordination. So those guys are holding hands as we leave World War II and go forward. And then supposedly the SAS, which is the equivalent of the Green Berets, who, by the way, is where we got the Green Beret from. The SAS were the ones that were originally the Green Berets, and it's kind of like a brethren thing now for our Army Special Operators. So we move on to Britain's betrayal of Greek brothers in arms in support of fascism. So for those of you who don't know, Greece was originally attacked during World War II by Mussolini's troops. Mussolini was part of the Axis evil, and they were able to shove off the Italians, not known as great fighters anyway. And then they were reattacked by Germany. Germany was able to break the resistance and basically took over Greece. The Greece formed an organization called People's Liberation Army. Now, a lot of people have tried to say that they were made up of predominantly communist, but there's also another argument that says they were not predominantly communist. They were nationalists trying to get their country back. So we will just leave that up in the air because it's not even really relevant other than for propaganda. The EAM was the political wing of the People's Liberation Army that again, she says that was dominated by Greek communists. Other people would argue they were nationalists, whatever. But the important part is they made up about 2/7 of the population of Greece. ELAS operations were supported by the British Secret Army initially. So they were getting their supplies to fight the Axis powers of Hitler internal to Greece. But the British wanted to reinstate King George II, who basically had cooperated with a fascist dictator that they already had in Greece. Greece had been under the control of basically a fascist dictator from 36 to 41 called Metaxas, Metaxas. So they're basically wanting to reinstall that guy who's a fascist and the king, who was not very popular at all. So they're basically trying to make Greece kind of like a protectorate of British Empire by installing their patsies there. Well, the nationalists were not having any of that. They didn't want that at all. So then all of a sudden, British pulls all of their support for the nationalists against Hitler, and at the same time created in 1944 a new Greek army unit called Greek Mountain Brigade, or the Hellenic Raiding Force, LOC. So those people are now going to basically be fighting, and these are British. They're basically going to be fighting against the nationalists inside of Greece. So you have the Greek nationalists fighting against both the Nazi occupiers and the British government. So eventually the Greece were able to get rid of the Nazis. Later, ELS secured victory over the German occupiers, and Hitler was forced to withdraw his soldiers. But then British demanded that they support that they immediately disarm. Well, they refused to disarm because they made a counter offer saying, hey, we'll disarm if you get your Hellenic raiding force out of here and get rid of their arms. British refused to do that. And then you have the telltale thing that I described of the false flag. They agitate, they get a whole bunch of people in the town center, and they have snipers on, this is in Athens, they have snipers on the roof, which are Gladio operators. There's a command heard given, shoot the bastards, and they open fire, aiming primarily at women and children for the most emotional effect. And then Churchill faced an angry House of Commons, which demanded an explanation for the barbarity that had happened, while admitting that it had been a shocking thing. He said that it was stupid for them people to bring kids to the city center. What? So basically, as a result, the citizens are all in shock. British reinstalls King George II. A succession of weak British puppet governments follow. The Greek resistance, though, are totally pissed off. So in March of 1947, the President Truman is part of the, so they've got this ongoing, basically civil war going. Britain convinced President Truman that he needed to send forces to Greece. And so we basically invade Greece and take it over in support of a monarchist and a fascist dictator. That became our first post-World War II operation. And immediately after we did that and basically put down the resistance of the nationalists, Greece joins NATO in 1952. You see what we're doing? We're just going through all of them and getting them into NATO so that we can control them. And there's documentation that establishes the connection to CIA and the funding of all of this. And also, I'll put out there for people who want to do further research, the Gladio unit inside of Greece was known as Operation Sheepskin, kind of like a wolf in sheep. Yeah. So there you have it. Also, the author goes on to talk about the American Gladio arm with the National Security Act of 1947, which allowed for the creation of the CIA, supposedly under the flow, to stem the flow of communism. It obviously allowed for them to participate in psychological warfare. And then, of course, it was turned on the American people. The national elections in Europe in 1948 had been a primary motivation for the establishment of the OPC. And the OPC is basically the operational element of the CIA. Now, I want to quote this because this is very important for us. The OPC attempted to influence, this is out of the Church Commission. This is a quote. The OPC attempted to influence the election results with considerable success. These activities form the basis for covert political action for the next 20 years. By 1952, approximately 40 different covert actions were underway in one Central European country alone. Until 1950, OPC's paramilitary activities were limited to plans of preparation for stay-behind networks in the event of a future war. Requested by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, these projected OPC operations focused once again on Western Europe and were designed to support NATO forces against Soviet attack. So they have found 100% that the CIA influences elections. They did it here. They did it here in 2020. You only have to ask, where else have they done it and when else have they done it? We know that they tried to do it in 2016. How long have they been doing it? My guess would be since 1947, just a guess. George Kennan selected Frank Wisner as the first commander of the CIA Covert Action Unit, OPC. Now, Wisner, we've talked about routinely. Wisner was in the State Department doing all of these same things out of the State Department during World War II that he is now going to be doing in the CIA. He's not new to this. There was an operational arm in the State Department before they created the CIA, and Wisner was in charge of it. This is a quote from Kennan, who says, they tended to be white Anglo-Saxon patrons from old families with old money, and they somewhat inherited traditional British attitudes toward the colored races of the world, unquote. Wisner became the chief architect of the network of secret armies in Western Europe. I would also add that I believe he began designing the network here as well. And then it goes on to talk about how the different special forces elements of the SAS bled over into the U.S. and the creation of the U.S. Forces Command, the Fort Bragg unit, the Psychological Warfare Center that's located at Fort Bragg has all been used for the psychological operations of Operation Gladio. And just how all of that interfaced with the CIA branch. Then the author talks about de Gaulle and NATO. We've kind of already covered all of this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is the repeated attempts of assassination. A lot of it had to do with Algeria and his stance, because keep in mind, these pan-Europe fascists want to use Africa as a slave colony. And freeing slave countries allows them to basically deplantation. They view each of these countries under the authoritarian fascist rule of a European power as part of theirs. It's theirs. It's not like those people own themselves. They're not actually people. They're cows, and they're on a cattle ranch. So the fascist people that control Gladio were outraged that Charles de Gaulle thought that you could remove the fences off the cattle ranch. And that's literally the way they think about this. And I would like us to start using their words against them. They call us cattle. And so we should actually articulate it that way. Charles de Gaulle had the gall to articulate the removal of the fences from the cattle farm in Algeria. JFK was very much in agreement with Charles de Gaulle that Algeria should be given their freedom. These fascists absolutely did not want it. They created an entire civil war in Algeria fighting the OAS guys from the defunct France. So they deploy there under a Gladio, and they're basically going to fight the freedom fighters of Algeria, true freedom fighters, true nationalists, in trying to free Algeria. And Charles de Gaulle was going to be made to pay for it with his life if these people had anything to do with it. Over 20 assassination attempts. During this fiasco is when Charles de Gaulle got so pissed off because he knew that this was being ran out of NATO. And I'm going to tell you how in a minute, how he knew this. He throws NATO out of France. He withdraws all of France's troops from NATO organizations, and they are forbidden to interact with NATO in any way, shape, or form. So the reason that we know this is because this just blew my mind. Okay, here's a quote. On this occasion, it was revealed that secret protocols existed concerning the fight against communist subversion, a lie, signed bilateral by the US and its NATO allies. De Gaulle denounced the protocols as an infringement on national security. Similar secret clauses were also revealed in other NATO states. In Italy, it was revealed that when becoming a NATO member in 1949, they had signed not only the Atlantic Pact, but also secret protocols that provided for the creation of an unofficial organization charged with guaranteeing Italy's internal alignment with the Western Bloc by any means, even if the electorate were to show a different inclination. And also, in the initial NATO agreement in 1949, it required that before a nation could join, it must have already established a national security authority to fight communism through clandestine citizen cadres. Let me translate that for you. To join NATO, every single country in NATO had to sign protocols first establishing Gladio units before they were ever even allowed in. And they had to identify a government entity that ran that, and that had to be done before you could be admitted into NATO. So where's ours? What's the organization that the US identified other than the CIA? Where's that agreement? It's in NATO. Is that why Trump was attacking NATO the way he did? Does Trump know about these secret protocols? Does Trump know about Operation Gladio? I'm going to bet he does. But that's just me. Next, the author goes on and talks about Gladio in Belgium. Now, Belgium is an interesting situation. Belgium has already basically divided itself into two different entities. They have, and I don't know if I'll get this right, but they have like a, a Flemish and a French ethnic population. So they're very divided. They don't live with each other. Um, they basically have two. So this is another point that I just want to hit real quick because this, I have to hammer this home all the time. Remember, after World War II, all of these countries had, not all of them, a lot of these countries had their national borders redefined, like making up Pakistan out of part of Afghanistan and India. So it is my premise, and I can go country by country and show you that those lines were established to promote divisiveness in wars. It's the military industrial complex built in demand for weaponry. If I create a boundary that separates culturally, it imprisons culturally diverse populations, therefore creating civil wars, but it also creates divisiveness over state boundaries as well. So in the case of Pakistan and India, you had encroaching people. They divided culturally aligned people down national boundary lines, and immediately they were fighting with each other over territory. To me, that's by design. And if it only happened one place, like right there, you might say, oh, they just screwed that up. It happened everywhere. It happened in Israel. It happened with Jordan. It happened with Syria. It happened with Iran. It happened with Iraq. It happened with Turkey. It happened with um, uh, Belgium. Belgium's a good example of it. So by trapping inside dislike people or taking like people and separating them across national boundaries creates friction. And what did we talk about? Chaos begets control, all by design. So here's a quote sex about Belgium. And it's interesting that that's where they moved NATO's headquarters, because what you're going to find out about Belgium is disgusting. Sex trafficking, industrial pedophilia, the reports of snuff movies made for political and financial blackmail or just for profit were all entangled in the black cobweb of spies, officially connived, drug running, the secret paramilitary network of Gladio, and the consistent meddling of NATO high command in the internal affairs of a country. That basically describes Belgium. Belgium's operations of Gladio are so gross. The people involved in it, the strife that it caused. This author uses another of his quotes, a residue. This is from NATO's Dagger at the Heart of Europe. A residue from wartime fraternization with Germans led to Nazi-style paganistic symbolism and mystical blood bonding ceremonies with the Belgium Stay Behind network and elements of the National Armed Forces, which in any event was inclined to the right already. This mystical streak was set for a chilling significance in shaping many of the perversions yet to be wrought on Belgium. And so basically, they use that whole, their Gladio units also is referred to on the French side, because even that's separate, SDRA-8, and on the Flemish side, STC/MOB, MOB. So those are basically the 2 elements. We also find, the General Lemetsker, he was in charge when they were kicked out of um, France and moved to Belgium. So his understanding of just how perverse Belgium was probably had something to do with the picking of the new location. Um, but they've had so many false flags in Belgium, creating, they also, if y'all will remember the big stadium, that all of the people, it was a soccer match. And that was one of their false flags. They had like 40 some people killed, where when you get down into the nuts and bolts of it, the stadium was old and decrepit. It was against the UK, and they crammed all these people in. They basically kept 10% of the security, and then there's a large population of skinheads in Belgium. They infiltrated them into the stadium, and they started picking fights with all of the different areas of the stadium and created basically a riot. And there were massive amounts of people injured and killed as a result of that. That was a false flag that happened. And if I'm not mistaken, it was right before an election that it happened. So they talk about that. Also, the author goes in, which we've covered extensively, the Italy one, and how the propaganda do was a large element, how the Vatican played into their Gladio unit by laundering money from all of the drug networks all over, to include the Golden Triangle in northern Afghanistan and Turkey. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on going over the Italian one because we have covered it a lot. Also, the assassination of the Italian prime minister was part of their Operation Gladio. They blew up train stations. They blew up a bank at a time where it was affected all of the locals more so than any other time that they could have picked.